Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on AB 138, the Elder Economic Planning Act. We appreciate all of your interest in joining us today for a discussion about the law and how it can be implemented by the area agencies on aging. I wanted to recognize our webinar co-hosts for today's webinar, including the California Department of Aging, the California Association of Area Agencies on Aging, C4A, the Insight Center for Community Economic Development, and also UCLA Center for Health Policy Research. Now, today's webinar is really focused on giving you the tools to know what the Elder Economic Planning Act is, what it requires that you include as part of your area plans, and also some information from your fellow Area Agency on Aging colleagues as to how they are using the Elder Index. And so that we hope by the end of this webinar, you will know the answers to all of these questions. And before we officially get started, we did want to recognize those who will be panelists on this webinar today, as well as those whom you can contact after the webinar should you have any questions. From the Department of Aging, we have Ed Long, Deputy Director, as well as Michael Allward, Policy Manager of the Data and Fiscal Teams, and Lilith Tovmasian, a data analyst with CDA. And for any questions specifically related to AB 138 that you would like to direct to CDA, please contact Michael, and his email address is provided on this slide. From the C4A, the California Association of Area Agencies on Aging, we have Daryl Kelch, who is not able to join us today but is available for questions should you have, and I did want to recognize that C4A was a co-sponsor on this particular bill and now law, and we greatly appreciate their support. I am Jenny Chung Mejia with the Insight Center, and I'll be speaking a bit more about what the Elder Index is and ways in which it's been used by the AAA community. And very proud to also represent today UCLA Center for Health Policy Research, Steve Wallace, who is our research partner on the Elder Index. He is also not available to join us today, but if you should have any detailed questions about the Elder Index data itself, feel free to either contact Steve or myself. And lastly, a big thank you to Mike Torres with PSA 10, who is the Director of Contracts and Planning, who will be sharing with you today how PSA 10 is using the Elder Index, not only in their area plans, but also in their own service delivery and planning processes. And also thank you to Michael Gavigan with PSA 19 and Sandy Taylor with PSA 21, who have also provided examples for you to see how other AAAs are using the Elder Index data. So we're looking forward to a very rich webinar today. And to kick us off, wanted to have the California Department of Aging speak a little bit about the law itself and what the AAAs are required to do in order to comply with this new law. And with that, I'm going to transfer it over to the Department of Aging.
Thanks, Jenny. Good morning, everyone. This is Lilith speaking. So we wanted to begin with a brief background on the Elder Index and what's required from CDA's perspective based on this new legislation that was passed. The Elder Index, as you know, also as AB 138, was chaptered into law in October of 2011, and it is now part of the Welfare and Institutions Code. It set forth new requirements for AAAs to follow when developing their area plans. As far as definition in general terms, the Elder Index means an index available on the Internet that quantifies the cost in the private market for meeting the basic needs of elders, including but not limited to the cost of essential household items, food, healthcare, shelter, transportation, and utilities. The Elder Index is updated biannually by the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research, and we will discuss this in greater detail during the next section of our presentation. The intent of the legislature is for CDA and AAAs to use the Elder Index as a planning tool in the development of local area plans and as a guide in allocating existing resources that support senior services in their communities. However, the Elder Index does not replace the Older Americans Act and Older Californians Act federal poverty criteria for client eligibility, reporting, and targeting individuals with the greatest economic need. It also does not replace the allocation of state and federal funds. Next. Okay, there are also minimum requirements AAAs must adhere to based on this change. As you're aware, each AAA area plan must include the following: assess the needs for services that are reflective of the community needs, identify sources of funding for those services, develop and implement a plan for delivery of those services based on those needs, and consider available data and population trends. With the implementation of AB 138, AAAs must also use the Elder Index as a reference when making decisions about allocating existing resources. AAAs may also incorporate the Elder Index in their needs assessment and or goals and objectives sections of their area plans. They can also incorporate the County Elder Index spreadsheet in the area plans. Also important to note is that these requirements are applicable only if certain criteria are met. The Elder Index is updated and made available to AAA. The Elder Index calculations are based on county-level information, and the Elder Index displays each county-specific data. So I'm going to turn it over to Ed now to talk about a forthcoming program memo and to answer some of the questions that AAA has submitted ahead of this webinar. Next slide, please.
So the California Department of Aging, to support area agencies on aging in implementing the Elder Index, has updated its needs assessment guidance for area agencies on aging to include reference to the Elder Index and a link to Elder Index information through UCLA. That program memo transmitting the needs assessment guidance was released on March 28th and is available on the CDA website. We have also drafted a PM specific to the Elder Index that we will send out at the end of this week by April 6th for a one-week review period by AAAs so that you can ask any questions related to the content of that PM before the PM is finalized. And essentially the PM covers what the Elder Index requirement is under state law, provides a brief description of the Elder Index, and a number of useful links that will be discussed later in this webinar for more information for area agencies on aging. We've received a few questions regarding how CDA will be implementing the Elder Index in the future to see if there is any impact on targeting or the intrastate funding formula. So I'd like to address those now. One question had to do with, will CDA adjust targeting requirements based on the Elder Index? And our answer is that we will not adjust targeting requirements based on the Elder Index. The targeting requirements that currently apply are those outlined in the Federal Older Americans Act, which requires AAAs to target services to persons in greatest economic need and greatest social need, with particular attention to specific subpopulations, for example, people in rural areas. The Older Americans Act defines greatest economic need as the need resulting from an income level at or below the federal poverty line as defined by the Office of Management and Budget. Another question had to do with how AAA services could be offered to persons that are above the federal poverty line but within the Elder Index. In general, AAAs may provide Older Americans Act services to any individual over the age of 60, regardless of their income. Clients can be individuals who are above the federal poverty level and within or above the Elder Index threshold. So I would say now that AAAs already are offering services to persons who are above the FPL but within the elder index threshold. Another question is, how is CDA incorporating the elder index in the intrastate funding formula? CDA will not incorporate the elder index in the intrastate funding formula at this time. CDA is approved by the Administration on Aging and has been found in federal court to meet federal requirements. The Older Americans Act defines greatest economic need in terms of the federal poverty line and does not reference the elder index, and CDA is required in its intrastate funding formula to adhere to federal requirements. So we will not be incorporating the elder index in the intrastate funding formula.
Great. Thank you so much, Ed and Lilith, for that overview. I think it's very helpful to the AAAs to hear CDA's role and specifically the questions with regards to the implementation of AB 138, and certainly encourage all of those who are listening to this webinar to access the needs assessment write-up that Ed mentioned on the CDA website, and also to take the time to review and also respond to the forthcoming draft program memo to be released by this Friday, April 6th. So we wanted to turn our attention now to discuss in a little bit more detail information about the elder index itself, since it really is the cornerstone of this particular law. And just to back up to what Lilith said a minute ago, area plans must consider available data and population trends. And so through AB 138, by mandating the use of the elder index in all of the 33 area agency plans in California, it ensures not only consistency of the application of the elder index data, but also use of the most accurate measure of economic need for older adults in California. And we'll be going over some examples of that in just a moment. It is worth mentioning that AB 138 is the first law of its kind in the entire nation to pass mandating the use of the elder index at the statewide level and also at the local level through the area agencies on aging and also through CDA. And other states are currently interested in following suit. So we're certainly providing leadership in this particular area. So by way of introduction into the elder index, we thought it would be helpful to speak a little bit about the comparisons between the official federal poverty guidelines, which are currently and for about the last 50 years or so, the measurement that's been used to assess economic need, and the Elder Economic Security Standard Index, or Elder Index for short, which is the basis of AB 138. So what you see here on this slide is a side-by-side comparison of the federal poverty guidelines to the elder index. And there are some very distinct differences between the two measures. The federal poverty guidelines, as I mentioned, were developed about 50 years or so ago in the early to mid-1960s. They are updated annually for inflation. However, the basis of the methodology for the federal poverty guidelines are based on 1950s food survey data that showed that families spent 1/3 of their after-tax income on food, and is based solely on the cost of food and that consumption pattern at that time in the 1950s, and utilized the federal poverty guidelines were calculated by multiplying the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Thrifty Food Plan, which is the lowest tier of the 4 USDA food plans that was initially intended only for temporary and emergency use, multiplied that by 3, and essentially that was the base federal poverty guidelines measure that's been utilized ever since that calculation. And just for point of reference, at that time in the 1950s, the food survey data said that families spent 1/3 of their after-tax income on food, and based on more current consumer research, it shows that families spend closer to between 10 and 13% of their after-tax income on food. So you can see that there's quite a bit of a difference between today's consumption patterns compared to previous consumption patterns. And in addition to that, not only is that assumption no longer applicable today, but it also only assumes that food is a part of a person's basic basket of goods and needs. And in contrast, the elder index includes not just the cost for food, but also the cost to pay for housing, as well as transportation, healthcare, and miscellaneous costs, such as what it takes to do your laundry and clean your home, and the very basic basket of goods that any person needs, but particularly an older adult needs just to make ends meet. The federal poverty guidelines also do not vary by age or where you live. And so for the contiguous United States, the 48 states in the mainland, the federal poverty guidelines is exactly the same. So whether or not you live in San Francisco versus Little Rock, Arkansas, the federal poverty guidelines are exactly the same. And in terms of the fact that it doesn't vary by age, there are very, very slight distinctions between older adults and younger adults and children, but it doesn't get into the details of what somebody needs at various stages of their life. And so it's a very minor distinction, but generally does not vary by age. And so with all of this, the federal poverty guidelines are currently used for making some very important decisions, despite the fact that it has these various methodological flaws, which includes being used for eligibility determinations, prioritizing funding, and tracking trends over time, such as the annual poverty rates that come out. And so for 2012, the federal poverty guidelines, it's also known as the federal poverty level, or FPL, is just over $11,000 a year in 2012 for one person. And so as you can imagine, that figure is not even enough to pay for rent for a whole year in most places in California. So in contrast, in looking at the fact that the federal poverty guidelines, while being used for these very important determinations, but yet not being reflective of the high cost of living in California, we realized that we needed to come up with a metric that addressed all of the problems inherent in the federal poverty guidelines. And that's when the Elder Index and the idea behind the Elder Index was born. So the Elder Index is actually part of a national movement that started in the early to mid-2000s. And we, at the Insight Center, have partnered with Wider Opportunities for Women in D.C. to really take a look at what does it really cost older adults to make ends meet. And in order to do that, we really need to look at the difference in geographical costs to meeting your basic needs. And so in 2007, we developed, in partnership with UCLA Center for Health Policy Research, the California version of the Elder Index. And it's available at the county level, and in the case of Los Angeles, it's actually available for the city of Los Angeles, as well as the county of Los Angeles, minus the city. And it's been updated regularly. The most recent update came out in 2010. It's based on the larger basket of basic goods, not just food, but again, housing, transportation, healthcare, and miscellaneous costs. In addition to varying by county, it also varies by household type. It's currently available for an older adult or an older adult living in a couple, and it also varies by health status, whether you're in poor, fair, or good health. The Elder Index is calculated and assumes that we are talking about an older adult who is 65 or older and retired. And it's been used for program planning and evaluation, policymaking, such as in the case of AB 138 as an example, as well as benchmarking progress towards economic security for older adults who are in need. And when you compare the Elder Index, the average for the state of California for a single renter, so one older adult living alone, you see that that individual needs just over $22,000 a year. And so when you compare that to the current federal poverty guidelines, that's a difference of well over $10,000 a year. So what you're highlighting here and what you can see is that there is a great gap between the Elder Index, which is based on all publicly available data sources that show what it actually costs to make ends meet when compared to the federal poverty guidelines. So we're trying to highlight the entire community of older adults who are struggling to make ends meet and coming up with policy and programmatic solutions to help close that gap. So to take a little deeper dive into the Elder Index and what it means and why it's important that it's customized at a local level, what you see here on this chart is a comparison between San Francisco County and Riverside County. And the two rows of red highlighted figures just show that both housing followed by healthcare are the #1 and 2 drivers for the differences between cost of living in a particular jurisdiction. And in the case of specifically San Francisco compared to Riverside County, an older adult who rents a 1-bedroom apartment needs nearly $400 a month more than an older adult who rents a 1-bedroom in Riverside just to make ends meet and just to be able to cover rent as compared to in San Francisco County. And when you take that down all the way to the annual level, what you see is that on an annual basis, an older adult renting in San Francisco needs just about $6,000 more a year to cover the same basic basket of goods than an older adult in Riverside County. And when so many older adults are on fixed income, you can see that this difference and recognizing this difference is so critical and so important. And at the top of this slide, you can see the website where this data is available and can be accessed for not just these 2 counties, but all the counties in the state. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we highlighted in doing the side-by-side comparison between the federal poverty guidelines and the Elder Index is what we call the eligibility gap. And that's essentially showing those older adults who are in that gap with incomes above the federal poverty guidelines and yet still below the Elder Index. And as this particular visual shows, this is for Los Angeles County, although the graphic is fairly similar for every county across the state. What you see is that 45% of older adults are falling in this eligibility gap, where they are not necessarily recognized as being unable to meet their basic needs, and yet at the same time are falling into a position where they are not necessarily qualifying for supports that are tied to the federal poverty guidelines. So we are really trying to bring attention to this gap and highlighting the reality that older adults are facing here in our state. And this is one of the reasons why, for purposes of your area plans, you would be able to utilize this data, if anything, at a basic level as part of your demographic analysis or demographic profile of your particular service area, because you'll see that you paint a very different picture for your county when you're able to highlight all the older adults who are in need of your services. And just referring back to a reference that we made earlier about the importance of recognizing the differences in cost of living depending on where you live, particularly when individuals are on fixed income, this particular slide, specific for Sacramento County, but which can, again, be applied and is available for all the other counties in the state, really shows the gap that exists between various levels of income that are available and often fixed, and the Elder Index, and why it's important not to cut these programs any more than they have already been cut and at the levels that they're set at, because there still is a gap that exists. And so in this particular case, we've compared the Elder Index for a 1-person household living in Sacramento County to the median payment for Social Security, as well as the maximum payment for SSI, the Supplemental Security Income. And this particular slide was made a couple of years ago, but the point still stands, especially given the threats of cuts to these programs, that many times when older adults are reliant on just one, if not a combination of sources of income such as these, it's all that more critical that those income sources remain available to them at the levels at which they're currently being provided, if not at a higher level, because you just see that there's that gap between the $21,350 for what it actually costs to cover all of your basic basket of goods, whereas the medium Social Security payment and the maximum SSI payment are short almost by half. So it still leaves 50% of that space for an older adult to figure out how they're going to make up that difference. So it just shows really the critical role that these programs do play, and some of the serious financial hardships and decisions that older adults are having to make despite being recipients of these types of sources of income. So there's a whole suite of elder index data that we have been able to make available in addition to the base elder index data that shows what it costs to meet your basic needs and make ends meet in each county across the state. We've also done an analysis to show who's struggling. So how many and who are living below the elder index, on incomes below the elder index. And what the research has shown is that elder economic insecurity really differs depending on race and gender. And as we see here in some examples that highlight San Diego County in particular, women who tend to live longer and also who earn less both during their lifetime as well as in retirement are more economically insecure. And we find this pretty consistent across the state, where you have closer to 50% of women who are living alone as compared to just under a quarter of women living in couples struggling to make ends meet. That you compare women living alone versus men living alone, it's 50% of women in the county of San Diego who are living on incomes below the elder index as compared to 38% of men who live alone. So you can see that there's a huge distinction there. Many, many more women living in economic insecurity well into their golden years. And when you look at communities of color, elders of color are more economically secure than non-Latino white elders. And again, taking a look at just San Diego County, you see that 3/4 of Latino elders, followed by 63% of African American elders and 56% of Asian elders, are living below the elder index. However, that's compared to still a fairly high number of non-Latino white elders who are living below the elder index. 42% of non-Latino white elders are living below the elder index. So while it's exacerbated among elders of color and communities of color, you can see that elder economic insecurity is quite high even across the board. And so closing the gap, how can we use the elder index data, and how has it been used to really help address this gap that we see? And one of the examples that we wanted to highlight to just give you a sense of how this information has been used in a very powerful solution-based way has been provided to us by Paul Downey, one of our partners in San Diego County, who's the director of the Senior Community Centers of San Diego. And senior community centers, they run a family senior residence program that is also accompanied by meal service. And so they specifically target older adults living in San Diego who do not earn enough to make ends meet, and so ostensibly are living below the elder index. But with the housing and food assistance that Senior Community Centers is able to provide, they are able to improve their situation. And so Paul has been able to use the elder index as a way to benchmark progress towards economic security for those older San Diego residents who are part of their Potiker family senior residence. So as you can see in this chart here, and this is based on the first iteration of the Elder Index, an older adult living in San Diego needs close to $23,000 a year just to meet their basic needs. But because they are a resident of the Potiker family residence and they receive 2 meals a day, they are able to essentially reduce the expenses of each of the older adults living in that residence by just under $8,000 a month, and so a year, excuse me. So what that means is that at the end of the day, they're able to cover just over a third of the elders' basic costs, leaving them with $15,000 as opposed to nearly $23,000 of expenses that need to be covered. So it's a very important way and a really powerful way to actually quantify the impact of the services that are being provided. And so this may be an example of a way in which your AAA might think about utilizing this data to the extent that you're providing some kind of direct service or perhaps through your contracted agencies that do provide the services on your behalf. And so just to follow up on that example and to provide a few more general examples of how AAAs are using the Elder Index to make a difference. So planning, and that's the whole reason why we're having the webinar today, the Elder Index can be used in, and now is required to be used in the Planning Service Area Strategic Plans that all of you develop. And it's also been used as a risk measurement tool. In the case of PSA 4, they've developed an accessibility matrix where they've used the Elder Index as a way to measure the risk that is facing the older adult in their particular service area. And in addition, as a planning tool, it's also being used as a direct service advocacy and fundraising tool by the AAAs. In terms of financial education, and there's a few examples of this coming up later on in the next section, but PSA 19 and PSA 25 out of Los Angeles, they've partnered with the Insight Center on an elder economic case management pilot project where we've used the Elder Index in exactly the way that Paul's used it as a way to benchmark progress towards economic security as older adults in those PSAs are being connected with various benefits and resources. And so over time, we're able to track the progress that's being made by those older adults as a result of receiving intensive elder economic case management, as well as receipt of services that they're eligible for. And on the advocacy front, that's where all of the efforts over the last 3 years to get the Elder Economic Planning Act passed has come in. But it's also continually being used, the Elder Index, as a way to set the goal for building economic security. It actually helps you quantify a goal that your programs can strive for and your policies can strive for. And as we were having the discussion earlier about Social Security as well as SSI, the Elder Index has been a critical tool in fighting cuts to those particular programs, but also budget cuts to other vital programs that serve older adults. And we've also worked to use the Elder Index as a way to change eligibility for programs, even if that doesn't necessarily increase the dollars. So for example, in San Francisco, there's a county-funded long-term care fund called the Community Living Fund. And that particular fund pilot tested using the Elder Index as opposed to the federal poverty guidelines as eligibility for those programs, but simply making a direct translation to the Elder Index rather than simply increasing the eligibility for that particular program, but using the language of the Elder Index. So for example, you could see in a case where, you know, over 100% of the federal poverty guidelines might be used as eligibility, but that may only translate to closer to 70% of the Elder Index. By making that change, we're showing a shift in the way in which we talk about the programs, and a really important shift at that. So even where you're not increasing dollars, it's still important to, you know, the Elder Index can be used in that way. And then lastly, from an advocacy standpoint, the Elder Index has contributed not only at the state level to moving the way in which we redefine poverty, but also contributing to the movement nationally as to how we do that. And there have been efforts over the last several years to update the federal poverty guidelines. And just within the last year, the Census Bureau has released some updated figures related to a supplemental poverty measure that they have been calculating, which does not replace, but does exactly what the name suggests, supplements the poverty measure in order to consider some of the critical issues facing not just older adults, but the population in general with regards to how we measure economic security, including looking at geographic needs. So there's been a huge groundswell of support around this. And then lastly, for fundraising purposes, the Elder Index has been used as an effective and powerful fundraising tool for AAAs as a way to highlight the need within each particular service area and also make the case for the need for additional resources and support. And so with that general overview of some of the ways in which the Elder Index has been used and also a little bit more detail about the Elder Index itself, I wanted to turn it over to Mike Torres with PSA 10 to give us a little bit more of an idea of how AAAs themselves are using the Elder Index. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. So yes, as she mentioned, my name is Mike Torres. I'm with PSA 10 here in Santa Clara County with the Council on Aging Silicon Valley. And I just want to talk about one of the ways that we started using the Elder Index during this planning cycle to find out a little bit more about the seniors in our area. So one of the ways we did it was we commissioned a random sample telephone survey in December of 2011. We contracted an agency to call over 500 county seniors and ask them some basic questions. Ask them what their access to senior services was, how they found out information about senior services, what their interest in services was, and of course some demographic information. So along with some basic demographic information, we also asked for some expanded information like their living status, if they were living alone or with a spouse, their housing status, if they rent or own with or without a mortgage, and also their monthly income. So using this data, we were able to determine which respondents were falling below the Elder Index and which were above. And we were able to set up a crosstab and kind of see the differences between those two groups. Next slide. So some of the things we found were really enlightening, and I'll point out some of the things that jumped out at us. The way you read this slide is if you look at kind of each subsection. So if we look at male and female respondents together, we'll see that 2/3 of respondents who were below the Elder Index were female, and 1/3 were male. If you compare that to those above the Elder Index, 58% of respondents were male and 42% were female. So here we're seeing something that was talked about earlier in the webinar, that we do see more women falling below the Elder Index than men. Similarly, if we look at minority respondents, again, 2/3 of respondents who are falling below the Elder Index are of ethnic minority, compared to 1/3 are white non-Hispanic. And again, we see a kind of flip. We see more white non-Hispanic respondents above the Elder Index. One thing that did jump out as interesting was educational level. So we see that 61% of respondents below the Elder Index had an associate's or 2-year degree or higher, which is surprisingly high. There's quite a bit of educational attainment from those seniors falling below the Elder Index. We do see more above the Elder Index as well, but education, that is not necessarily the leading factor for falling below the Elder Index. Finally, we have a comparison of seniors who were born in the United States versus foreign-born seniors. And again, we see 45% of respondents below the Elder Index are foreign-born, as opposed to 24% of seniors who are above the Elder Index being foreign-born. Okay, next slide. So again, one of the primary things we wanted to learn from the phone survey was access to information, and how well do seniors have access to information on services. So one question we asked was, how easy or hard is it to access information about senior services? Overall, it was pretty good. Most respondents did seem to find information easy to find or somewhat easy. However, if you look at that top section there, twice as many seniors falling below the elder index found information very hard to find or somewhat hard to find. So 20% of those below the elder index believed it was hard to find, as compared with 10% of those above the elder index. The next section is how often do you use the internet. I know a lot of us are using the internet more in our outreach and information services. Again, access overall was quite good. However, we see a really significant difference between seniors below the index compared to above. So seniors below the elder index, 27% never use the internet, compared with just 6% of seniors who are above the elder index. So you're 4 times more likely to never use the internet if you fall below the elder index. So it just speaks to the need for diversity of outreach and the diversity of information that's required. Okay, next slide. So one of the things we found was it's a really significant access issue. So if you compare that previous slide to this slide, here we asked the respondents, what's your interest in receiving these certain services? I picked out a few that really jumped out, and overall, seniors falling below the elder index have a really high desire to receive these services and to access what's available. However, in a different slide that wasn't in the presentation, we see that the current use of the system is very similar. However, seniors falling below the index really desire some additional services. You'll see there's a huge disparity in help finding and employment, help applying for benefits, help finding housing, exercise classes. So these are things that exist in the community, but it seems like there's an access issue for those falling below the index. Okay, next slide. So overall, the elder index has given us, for the first time, the ability to truly estimate senior poverty in our community. We can definitively state there's many as 1 in 2 Santa Clara seniors who are struggling to meet their daily needs. And as was pointed out earlier in this section, and really from what I've seen throughout California, that seems to be the case for most counties and most PSAs. The seniors who are struggling are falling into the target populations that we've always targeted to address. So they're disproportionately minority, female, and older. And in fact, the phone survey has really shown us the #1 determinant of risk is income and inadequate income. More so than when we look at race or ethnicity, age, sex, education. All of those things, we do see an increased need, but without a doubt, over and over, we see that income is the #1 determinant. Seniors who are below the elder index have a hard time accessing information about these services, while at the same time being the most in need of those services. So that's kind of what we've learned from our needs assessment. We're still in the early stages of implementing, what we found and figure out a good way to implement it in our programs and advocacy. One way that we've started doing it is through our information and assistance program. So when our call center receives a call, they make a referral for a senior or a caregiver, we'll jot down their demographic information, so that information is logged. When a follow-up call is made and we see how effective the referral was, we can track when there's an unmet need and when a service or referral was inadequate for the individual. So from that, we can kind of gauge which services and what causes are really affecting seniors who are falling below the elder index and above the elder index. So it's kind of the first way we've started to evaluate the effectiveness of our services.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, for sharing what PSA is doing with the elder index and really the leadership that you all have taken around it. We have a few other examples from a couple of your other fellow AAA partners. One is from PSA 19, the Los Angeles County Department of Community and Senior Services. And as you can see here in the top bullet, this is the way in which the elder index is being cited in Section 2, the description of the planning and service area in their area plan. So just to give you a couple of a couple of points and ways in which this information can be used. And as you can see here, there's both a narrative statement about the importance of the Elder Index, but also the use of the demographic information that I spoke to earlier, looking at the number and the percentage of elders who are falling below. So for those of you who are still working on your area plans and will be working on other documents, these are just a couple of examples of the way in which you can use the Elder Index. And for PSA 19, the conversation around the Elder Index, and particularly conversation around the need to address the gap between the Elder Index and the federal poverty guidelines, has become a part of a conversation that extends beyond just the service area plans. And so in the case of PSA 19, the discussions about how the Elder Index data shows a greater need for services related to programs where eligibility is income-based has been a part of area plan committee meetings that they've been a part of. And in addition, for the Title V Senior Community Service Employment Program, CSEP staff, they've also had discussions about how the Elder Index can be used to enable greater number of participants to take part in that program, since the current eligibility is based on 100% of 125% of the federal poverty guidelines, as well as some age and resident restrictions. So that's one other example. And then in the case of the third example in this particular webinar with PSA 21 in Riverside County, here is another way in which the demographic information for that particular planning service area has been shown. And if you scroll down to the bottom, you can see here some of the estimates for the level of poverty that's based solely on the federal poverty guidelines, and you can see the unique makeup racially and ethnically of this particular planning service area. And in sort of contrast or comparison to that poverty information at the bottom of that previous slide, you can see that this is a slide that shows a couple of examples of the way in which Riverside County is displaying the Elder Index data for their particular service area. And so you see here, using the base Elder Index data information here at the top, looking at an owner who has a mortgage, without a mortgage, as well as a renter in a one-bedroom, and also including the demographic analysis and highlighting that eligibility gap between the Elder Index and the federal poverty guidelines, as well as the Elder Index and the Social Security and SSI payment amounts. And in Riverside County, they're also taking the use of the Elder Index data one step further in order to make a difference in the lives of older adults that they're serving. And the Elder Index has resulted in two specific goals that Riverside County is promoting. One is through a program called Aging with Independence that focuses on long-term supportive services. And through that particular program, they've cited to the in-home and community-based long-term care costs that were calculated by UCLA Center for Health Policy Research. That's, in essence, sort of a third part of the suite of Elder Index data sources that have been calculated. And this particular data source shows what it costs in addition to the base Elder Index in order to receive either a low, medium, or high level of home and community-based long-term care for each county across the state. And so that the link that you see here on this page takes you to the information specific for the long-term care costs. And in addition to citing to the Elder Index as part of the Aging with Independence program, Riverside County has also included the Elder Index and used it to inform their Caring for One Another program, which is a program targeted towards supporting caregivers of older adults, often who are older adults themselves. And they've compared information on the economic well-being of those caregivers to the Elder Index as a way to assess the economic health of the caregivers themselves. And what they found was that many of the caregivers are using their own money to provide caregiving, which is certainly something that is can be a threat to their own economic security, let alone the economic security of those that they are caring for. And so being really cognizant of the fact that that's taking place, and also coming up with ways in which they can support caregivers in their work to care for older adults. And in terms of action steps, Riverside County has been very active in outreach and education around the Elder Index and the need to acknowledge elder economic security as a goal. And they have hosted roundtables where they educated stakeholders on aging, including an Elder Index training that's been done. And they've also been active in the advocacy efforts around using the Elder Index instead of the FPL, including the advocacy efforts around getting AB 138 signed into law. And so with that, before we conclude our webinar, we just wanted to answer a few questions that also came up with regards to not just AB 138, but also the Elder Index data that we received from some of you in advance of this webinar. One question was, when will the next demographic analysis be done? And so that's the information that looks at those older adults who are falling below the Elder Index by numbers, percentage, as well as by race, gender, and household status. And that information was last released in 2009. And typically what we do is each time we update the base Elder Index data, we do try to stagger and have the demographic analysis follow the year after. In this case, we recently updated the Elder Index data earlier this year to make available for the AAAs to use as part of their area plans pursuant to AB 138. And we actually are looking to do another update of the base Elder Index data itself for release in early 2013 so that the most current Elder Index data can be made available. And so for right now, we've actually prioritized focusing on updating the base Elder Index data itself, and we'll certainly look into support for the demographic analysis at a future time. A second question that came up in a previous conversation from one of the AAA planners was, did your PSA use housing as a topic in public hearings for the new 2012 through 2016 area plan? And based off of responses from 10 of the AAAs who responded to that particular question, 7 or 70% of those AAAs responded that they did use housing as a topic in public hearings for the new 2012 through 2016 area plan. And lastly, there was a question raised about the long-term care costs that I just referred to and when those will be updated again. And similar to the demographic analysis, we're currently focusing on making sure that all the AAAs have updated Elder Index-based data before crunching the numbers for either the demographic analysis or the long-term care costs, which were last released in 2008, but based on 2007 data figures. So those two pieces, the demographic and the long-term care costs, are currently on hold since the priority is really to make sure that the AAAs get the most updated Elder Index data that they can use. And so with that, I just wanted to reiterate again that we do plan on releasing another update of the Elder Index, and we will be releasing it with some additional family types to complement the single older adult and older adult living in a couple in early 2013. And just to circle back to the earlier reference, so as Ed mentioned, CDA will be releasing a draft program memo later this week, and have provided a week's time for the AAAs to review and respond, and we certainly encourage you to do that, and also to visit their website as well as the website of either UCLA Center for Health Policy Research or the Insight Center, which you see on your screen, to access additional information, and certainly encourage you to reach out to any one of us should you have specific questions for us regarding how to comply with the new law, AB 138. So with that said, I just wanted to bring this webinar to a close, thank our panelists and our co-hosts for their support of this webinar, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.